All right, this is chapter 22, and we're going to be talking about issues dealing with managing our waste. So there are a few important terms that you need to know as we start this unit. Make sure you know the difference between municipal solid waste and industrial solid waste. So the trash coming from your house or from LHS would be municipal. The trash coming from a factory or a mining area would be industrial solid waste. And then hazardous waste has its own category. You can have hazardous waste at your house, or it can come from those industrial areas, but it gets treated in a completely and separate different way. We will be talking about wastewater, but more specifically in our upcoming water unit. So you're going to see more about it soon. So here's the big spoiler alert for this unit. The best way to reduce the impact of your waste is just not to make it. So reduce the waste stream. Make better choices about packaging and materials. That's better than trying to figure out how to get rid of it, how to recycle it, or how to compost it. Your household waste is called municipal waste. And our biggest source of municipal waste is actually paper, even though you could, in theory, recycle much of it. So think about all the Amazon boxes people get. Much of our waste comes from those short-term uses such as packaging. It's pretty astounding to think that you generate about 1 ton of waste per year, almost 5 pounds a day. And unfortunately, those trends are just rising. One of the activities we have done in past years is to keep a personal record of our trash, bring our trash in, sort it out into categories, and weigh it. And most students are pretty shocked when they see that the impact of the lab, how much trash they actually do produce every day. Consumption is already an issue in developed nations such as the United States, and it's increasing in our developing nations, places like India. When did you last throw away something that was just broken? It wasn't broken, it's just not useful to you anymore. Maybe you could have given it away or sold it or reused it in a different way. We're all guilty of this. We've gotten way better at recycling more of our waste over the years in the US, but most waste that does not get recycled still ends up in landfills or it's incinerated. Sanitary landfills in the US are regulated by a federal law called RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act. Make sure you know this. This is one of the Big 10 laws. We're going to get more details on an upcoming slide, but know that it is the law that regulates our landfills. Oops, ignore that. Okay, so here's a little diagram of a landfill. In a landfill, the waste is broken down partially by bacteria, and then there's just some natural decomposition. It's also compressed. And we are so fortunate in Kansas. We have great soils for landfills. So people actually pay to send their trash to us. How about that? Landfills that are full have to be capped and maintained under specific guidelines laid out by RCRA. A leachate collection system collects any liquids and drains them out of a landfill. It's important that they don't escape or contaminate the soil and water, so there's a liner that protects that from happening, although sometimes they do fail. Our local landfill is maintained by the company you see at the bottom, HAM, and the city contracts with them, and it's located near the town of Perry. So the downside of landfills is that the decay system is very slow. So you could, in theory, pull out an old newspaper, 40, 50 years old, and still read it. Sometimes the leachate system fails and you get leakage into the groundwater. And then NIMBY is a big problem. We're going to talk more about NIMBY in upcoming units, but NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. I don't want a landfill in my backyard. You probably don't either. So nobody wants to live next to them, even though we all need them. Incineration is another option for waste disposal, so basically burning your trash in an industrial facility. The downsides are that the ash is hazardous and it has to be disposed of according to hazardous waste rules. And then hazardous chemicals might be released during the burning process. Scrubbers are devices that are designed to trap hazardous particles and neutralize harmful gases, so they are required. I would take a minute and pause the video right here and just take a look at this diagram. Occasionally we'll get a diagram like this on an AP test and you'll be asked about names of certain parts or how a certain system like this functions. And so it's good just to kind of practice looking at it and seeing if you can figure it out. So pause right here for just a minute, take a look at the diagram, and then start the video again. Okay. So looking at the diagram, you can see that the waste is dumped and then it is burned a little bit at a time. And the fire heats up water in the boiler. And that water is used to turn a turbine. The steam that is generated turns a turbine, and that powers up a generator, which feeds into a grid. So this is a way to produce some energy, is through incineration. You could take advantage of that to produce some energy for utilities. Meanwhile, a lot of the steam is also pumped out through the scrubber, number 4, and into the baghouse filters. So the baghouse are that series of filters you see there, and they remove the particulate matter that might have been in the air and could be harmful to people for breathing. So they're taking those particulates out of the air before it is released in a purified form through the stack. And in the meantime, you can see at the bottom that the ash is collected and it has to be treated as hazardous waste in special landfills. As trash decomposes, bacteria produces methane gas. You know, that stinky smell. And that landfill gas can be trapped and processed and used to sell back as gas for energy, natural gas. If it's not productive to do so, if you don't want to invest in the equipment to do that, it can also be burned off rather than just letting it escape. Because if it escapes, it's methane gas, which will act as a greenhouse gas in our environment. We're going to come back to this idea in our energy unit, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what Lawrence does with its landfill gas. It's pretty interesting. Composting is another way to reduce waste in landfills and incinerators. You can purchase a simple composting container for your yard, which kind of looks like a plastic bin, or you can even just make one. If you make a circle out of chicken wire, you can use that to compost your yard waste like leaves and cut grass and limbs. It's not the best idea to use the chicken wire style for food scraps because you might be attracting critters you don't want to your yard. But the plastic composters are great for producing compost for your garden. Earthworms are another way to do some natural composting. You can keep a bucket at your house. Even people who live in apartments can keep a small bucket of them. And you toss your food scraps in with a little strategic planning. The picture above is a large-scale earthworm composting facility. This picture was taken at the Leavenworth Prison. And earthworm compost is pure gold for growing plants. We had a little earthworm colony in the APES classroom for a few years. One of the downsides is that you can also get a little fruit fly infestation, which nobody enjoys. So you have to be careful about that. The City of Lawrence already has established municipal yard waste programs. So you have a certain day when you can put your yard waste out. You can either rent a bin from the city, or you can buy these paper bags like you see here, or you can tie them up with a certain kind of twine, things like branches, and leave the bundles for pickup. But it's nice that we have that composting facility, and that compost is then given out to people who are residents in the city. All right, so let's talk a little bit about recycling. While recycling is not always the best option, it's better than landfills and incineration. Our community is really lucky because we have a state-of-the-art materials recovery facility, or MRF is what we call it. And most years we tour it with APES, of course, not this year. But it is pretty amazing. It uses some great German engineering. One of the challenges of recycling is that you need to have a market for those recycled materials and goods once you sort them. And unfortunately, China has started to refuse a lot of the recycled materials from the United States, so we've lost one of our big markets. And so you have to figure out what you're going to do with it once you get it recycled. So hazardous waste can be defined as ignitable, corrosive, reactive, or toxic. Some heavy metals are hazardous, which makes disposal of electronics and other goods quite tricky. These metals can bioaccumulate and biomagnify in our bodies and in the ecosystem. Take a look at these two posters that show health effects of mercury, lead, and arsenic poisoning. Sometimes mercury poisoning is confused with ADHD. Mercury poisoning is also the source of the term mad as a hatter because mercury was used to make hats in the old days, and that was the downfall of many a hatter. We've already talked about e-waste, but this is just a good reminder that e-waste should not go into your regular municipal trash because it's not really suitable for landfills. The City of Lawrence has a household hazardous waste facility that you can access by appointment, and you can drop off materials such as paints or cleaners or other chemicals like pool chemicals, and you can also request to pick them up and use them. All right, so once again, in your notes, highlight, star, make sure you know RCRA. And not only does it govern our landfills, it governs how we treat hazardous waste. So hazardous waste generators have to have special permits. And kind of the catchphrase that is tied to RCRA is from cradle to grave. Cradle to grave means that we are tracking these chemicals and compounds from the time that they are created in a factory until the time they're disposed of to try to make sure we know where they end up and to keep them from ending up in some kind of illegal dumping situation like you see here. So hazardous waste can be disposed of in 3 different ways. The hazardous waste landfills have stronger, better liners and better leachate systems to try to keep the hazardous waste away from groundwater. Surface impoundments are like shallow ponds that are lined with clay and special plastic liners. So the idea is that it's liquid, the liquid evaporates, the solids that are left behind are then transported somewhere else. So the downside is that you can get cracks in those liners, and if there is rainfall, you can have flooding events. Deep well injection is something kind of horrible. That is actually, this technique has been used around the Kansas City area by one of our large waste management companies that we used to contract here in Lawrence. So basically they drill a well deep into the ground, in theory below the water table, and they inject waste into it. And it can be okay, but these wells often will have leaks, and they can cause hazardous waste to leach into the groundwater and the soil. Here's another one of the 10 laws you need to know for the AP test. It is called CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Resource Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. So it is known kind of synonymously with the word Superfund. So CERCLA and Superfund go hand in hand. The EPA regulates this law, and it is a federal law. And the whole idea is that it's there to deal with cleanup of hazardous waste. So these hazardous waste sites are called brownfields. 2 famous Superfund sites include Love Canal in New York, where land was sold very cheaply to a neighborhood to build a school, and there were many homes around this area, and it turned out that there were toxic chemicals seeping into the ground, and many people and children were sickened by these toxic chemicals, and there ended up being a federal standoff. The citizens were so angry nothing was being done, they actually held a federal agent captive in order to make change. Closer to home, we have Times Beach, which is near St. Louis, about 20 miles from St. Louis. Little town. The roads were dusty, so they sprayed them with some kind of an industrial oil, which ended up being a huge source of toxic dioxins. Animals were dying, people were getting sick, And basically, they moved everybody out of the town, and it's now a ghost town. Superfund sites are evaluated and prioritized based on need. Public hearings are held so that the public knows what's going on. When I worked as a GIS consultant in environmental consulting, I did work for a Superfund site, which was part of Fort Riley, the military base, and they have dry cleaning stations at every military base to keep their uniforms nice and clean. And they had dry cleaner fluid that had gotten into the groundwater and contaminated it. So that was my job, to help them map the damage. CERCLA mandates that the polluter pays for the cleanup, but there was once a government fund established to pay for it. Unfortunately, there was so much need, it's now bankrupt. So taxpayers typically end up paying for that cleanup instead. All right, and that is the end of chapter 22, how to deal with our waste.